Hello, everyone. This week's topic is gods, goddesses, and lesser spirits, guardians, messengers, and monsters. So this week is a little bit different than other weeks in that we take a moment to consider what are sometimes called the lesser figures that show up in mythological stories. And they're called lesser because they're often not as celebrated as perhaps the protagonists or the main characters or figures in stories are, like the hero, for example. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a key role in the story to play. And actually, many times, without these figures showing up, the story or the myth would simply, well, the plot of the story of the myth would not move forward. So I think it's interesting to sometimes consider those figures, those characters, those monsters, those guardians, those helpers, those other archetypal figures that show up for us in myth, and the different functions that they have, the different representations that they have, and essentially the ways that they show up. So this week is kind of a mishmash of this concept of lesser spirits or lesser gods and goddesses, as well as other figures that we see show up, other creatures that we might see show up, guardians, messengers, and monsters, all of whom often play perhaps less, as I say, less celebrated roles in myth, but equally as important because they move the stories forward. And we need them. They have to be there in order for the stories to move forward. Okay, so in this particular PowerPoint, what you will notice is that there is a lot of imagery. So just like you did in your connecting myths and artifacts assignment, in this PowerPoint, what I have done is I have included lots of artifacts and images that show us how these different figures have been represented in mythology and the ways that they show up in our archaeological artifacts, in our art, and the ways that they show up symbolically as well. What sort of motifs we see presented to us. So I'm just going to go through and give you a little bit of an explanation of each, as well as highlight some other characteristics of the key figures that we're discussing this week. So first of all, we come to guardians, right, who are oftentimes watchmen, gatekeepers, or protective spirits of something, right? They can be deities, so they can be gods or goddesses. They could also be monsters. They could be animals, or sometimes they could even be demons. They might guard things like bridges, roads, doorways in cemeteries, sacred spaces, kingdoms. They might stand guard at the portals of heaven. Sorry. Or they might protect gods, emperors, or wild creatures, and so on. Okay, they have a variety of different functions. They also might protect humans and domestic affairs. So, for example, we might have lesser deities, not the great celestial gods, but lesser gods that might attend to the kitchen, for example, or guard over the kitchen for us, or guard over the hearth, as is the case with Hestia or Vesta in Greek and Roman myth. Or they might guard over women in childbirth, or they may guard over also professional occupations. There are certain gods and goddesses that are often connected to certain professional occupations, like doctors, lawyers, and so on and so forth, protectors of the law. Okay, so we have some examples of guardians of the underworld here. And in particular, And now the underworld is a very sort of popular place to have a guardian. And what you will notice also about this week is that some figures from Greek and Roman myth do show up, because Greek myth is particularly, um, how shall I say, there are many guardians, messengers, and monsters that show up for us in Greek myth. And so you will see a few of those figures show up here. Okay. So first of all, we have, this place, the underworld, which is a popular place to have a guardian of, because we want to make sure that we're careful of who gets in, and definitely we want to make sure we're careful of who gets out. So we have Kerberos from Greek myth, right, who usually has 3 snarling heads with writhing snakes, stands sentry at the gates of Hades, or yes, shall we say the land of the dead, or Tartarus, okay? Turns away the living, usually, and frightens souls that must pass through the gate, prevents the dead from leaving the underworld. Okay, and Kerberos shows up for us in many Greek myths. And then we have Garm, or Germ, from Norse mythology. And I have a quote here: Garm of the bloody breast, similar role at the gate to hell, the Norse underworld. The name means barking, or ceaselessly howls. It does not stop the dead from leaving the underworld. When the gate is opened, the dead emerge and they roam the earth. Okay, so Germ in contrast to Kerberos, doesn't keep people from getting out. It's interesting. Okay, we also have Charon from Greek myth, who does not allow the living to cross the river Styx, which they have to do, the dead have to do in order to enter the underworld. Charon was originally a demon of death that took the form of a dog, and became the ferryman of the Greek underworld. We also have Shentu and Yulu. These are from Chinese mythology. They guard the gates of hell to prevent the dead from leaving the domain of the lords of death, the 10 Yama kings. They stand beside a massive door on the mountain that serves as a barrier between the land of the living and the land of the dead. They capture and punish ghosts that try to escape their fate, and they imprison them with 2 vicious tigers. Okay, and then we also have Tokonaka, which is from Native North American mythology, particularly the Hopi. And Tokonaka oversees the punishment of the dead. So to enter the town of the dead, the Hopi must pass the guardian, who waits in the Grand Canyon at the place where the first people emerged into the world. Now this is interesting, because this is a creation myth that is an emergence myth, right? So people came out of the ground. It's interesting. Allows good spirits to take a straight path, but spirits that require purification must take a fork in the trail that leads to 4 pits of fire. And if they are cleansed in the first, second, or third pit, they return to the path. But if they get to the 4th, they are consumed in flames. It's a difficult journey to have to undertake. So I've given you some examples here of images of Kerberos in particular, that creature from Greek mythology who guards the underworld. In the first image, both in the first and second images here, you have Hercules, or Heracles, who is connected to Kerberos on his journey to and from the underworld. Okay, that lovely 3-headed dog. Snarling heads with writhing snakes. Sometimes it looks like a dog. In the imagery that we have here, Kerberos really looks like a dog. What we will see, particularly in regard to, in this case, we're looking at guardians, but the guardians are also sometimes monsters, right? So we have an overlap there. What we'll see in terms of how the monsters are represented, or in this case, the guardian is represented, is that there's great variety in the imagery. So Kerberos has been described as having 3 snarling heads with writhing snakes. It could be that the neck is depicted as snake-like, but the head is of a dog. Or it could be that the head is the snake part and the body is the dog, and so on and so forth. So it just depends on how the imagery surfaces. Now, these paintings are both from this 1600s. So 1634 is the first one by Francisco de Zurbarán, and the second one is 1645 by Jacob van Campen. Okay, so in both cases, I believe the heads look like dogs. All right. Moving on, we have guardians of treasure, guardian, or also places sometimes, right? Again, so we have, of course, the underworld is a place, but we have other places where we may have guardians. They typically guard the objects that heroes seek on their quests. Now, again, Greek myth is really well known for having guardians of treasure in particular, right? So we have a few examples here. We have dragons. So Ladon, which is a Greek dragon, a 100-headed dragon with many voices that guards the golden apples in the garden of the Hesperides. Also, other sort of dragon type creatures. Jason in the Golden Fleece, he has to deal with a dragon type creature. Beowulf also kills Grendel. And again, Grendel is kind of a reptilian creature. So again, there's variety in the imagery here. What we often see is multiple heads, snake-like necks, and reptilian skin, right? And the hero, of course, has the challenge of figuring out how to kill the guardian, right? Also, the python, or the gigantic serpent, for example, again from Greek myth, the one who oversees the oracle at Delphi until Apollo kills it and claims the oracle as his prize. This is how, of course, Apollo becomes so closely connected to that oracle at Delphi and pretty much controls her. We also have giants, for example. Hermes, again in Greek myth, kills Argos, the giant with 100 eyes. We have Zeus, again in Greek myth, changes Io into a heifer, into a cow, if we're familiar at all with this story. And then Hera, Zeus's wife, takes possession of her and puts Argos, who is a giant, in charge of guarding her. Hermes has to put Argos to sleep before he can kill him. So this is Hermes' challenge again. We also have Gilgamesh and Humbaba, who we'll see come up a little bit again later. Humbaba is a giant who protects the cedar forests of Lebanon until he's killed by Gilgamesh and Enkidu. And this is part of Gilgamesh's journey in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Guardians of places as well. We have Chinese Western Paradise on the slopes of Mount Kunlun, one of 6 sacred mountains, and the mountain has doors on each of its sides. The eastern door is guarded by a creature with 9 human heads and the body of a tiger. Okay. In Chinese myth also, we have a prominence of tigers and dragons as guardians. The dragon serves a slightly different function than it does in other mythological traditions, however, and it's often associated with fertility and with rain, and dragons are often guardians of rivers and lakes. In contrast to, say, Greek mythology, for example, where the dragon is, often a guardian of treasure. Also, if you think, for example, of, Western mythology, and you think about Lord of the Rings, for example, we have the dragon guarding the treasure, right? This is more often the case in Western myth, but in Eastern myth, or in particular in Chinese myth, often dragons are the guardians of things like water, right? Rivers, lakes, rain, that kind of stuff. Okay. Underneath here, I have a lot of pictures for you, actually. The first one is Etruscan, and it's a lion's head. First half of the 5th century BCE. The sculpture made of metal, the material is bronze. And it says lion's head, but it's called a chimera as well. And I'll explain that in just a second. In the next slide, again, you see another creature with sort of a variety of features, right? If you look at the lion's head, It doesn't totally look like a lion. And if you look at the next slide, you see, again, a different kind of creature. This one is Chinese, and it's also labeled a chimera. What we can sort of, I mean, there are lots of definitions of the chimera, but what we can consider is that the chimera is really a catch-all for a very scary mythological creature, okay? A very scary mythological monster that is oftentimes a guardian. And that depending on the mythological tradition or depending on the culture that the myth comes from, the chimera will take a different shape. So it will usually have a mixed bag of body parts, okay? In Greek myth, a chimera is a hybrid beast. It's believed that it originally comes from Anatolia, and it possesses a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. But as you can see, in other traditions, the chimera might look differently. Ultimately, the chimera is kind of the embodiment of our deepest fears in terms of monsters that we could come into contact with. If we can imagine the worst possible looking monster that we could come into contact with, this is the chimera. Okay, and whatever culture it's from, it's going to reflect the scariest version of the animal body parts that might make up that monster. Okay. On the next slide, again, we have this very, it looks like a tapestry, okay? Very kind of complex image here. And right in the center is Heracles, okay? So again, we go back to Greek myth a little bit here. This is Heracles, who is dealing with the Nemean lion. Okay, one of his labors, one of his 12 labors there. And then we keep going. Underneath this, again, we have a glyph here that looks very Mesopotamian in its, and very Middle Eastern in its imagery. Okay, most Mesopotamian myth, or Assyrian, this one is from the late Assyrian period, has this kind of imagery. The lines are very thin. The images of the gods, goddesses, or the people are very sort of thin, and the lines are quite heavy as well. Okay. So this one is sort of a greenish black serpentine impression. Okay. And it's from the late Assyrian period from the Middle East. And it says that this is a left horned serpent having long undulating coils extending across the bottom of the scene, head facing center, tongue extending from mouth. We have a bearded running god with hair hanging at the back of the neck, wearing a headdress, thrusting a dagger into the mouth of the serpent. So in this case, again, we're back to the reptile as the guardian or as the monster, right? That has shown up here. And there's a little bit more, I mean, we could go into the description a little bit more depth here. But what's interesting is that although the running god appears to be wielding a dagger, the usual Neo-Assyrian treatment of this theme shows the deity with the lightning trident of the weather god. The question remains whether the god in this case stands for the weather god. The serpent has been described as having the head of a bull. Okay. This particular cylinder or glyph is from the first millennium BC, so it's doubtful whether it depicts the Ninurta-Kur battle of Sumerian myth. However, there's an interesting connection here, which is why I'm telling you about this. In this version of the dragon-slaying myth Ninurta, the warrior god, son of Enlil, the air god, if we remember Enlil from our pantheon of Mesopotamian mythology, Enlil, the air god, is urged by his personified weapon, Sharur, to attack and destroy Kur. After Ninurta slays Kur, the primeval waters which Kur had held in check rise to the surface of the earth, so that no fresh water can reach the fields and gardens. Ninurta heaps stones over the dead Kur and thereby holds back the waters of the lower regions of the surface of the earth. He leads the waters flooding the earth into the Tigris. Ninurta is the prototype of the Babylonian god Marduk. So here's our connection, okay? When playing the role of the hero of the gods in the Babylonian epic of creation, which we read. An important feature of the Babylonian creation myth is the slaying of the dragon, the destruction of Tiamat by Marduk, in order that he may establish a rule entirely of his own, devising parallels a rule entirely of his own devising. This parallels the destruction worked by the Assyrian kings as a prelude to establishing their rule over the earth. So this image in particular, the archaeologists that have examined it are making a connection between Ninurta and Kur, and then later on Marduk and Tiamat. And so what they're explaining to us is that the battle of Marduk and Tiamat, and Marduk establishing himself as the one god, is what a king would do as well. So this sort of explains to us a little bit further the nature of the succession myth, what's called a succession myth, where one god or one king succeeds the previous. And so the archaeologists I got tongue-tied there. The archaeologists are suggesting that this is a kind of representation of how a king would take over. So it's interesting there. And again, the imagery is very common to Mesopotamian or Assyrian, Sumerian mythology. Okay. Here in the next slide, we have a vase painting from around 500 to 475 BCE, and we have Hercules fighting the Lernaean Hydra. So again, a reptilian creature, in this case with lots of heads, and he had to cut off the heads, and then his friend, his partner, Iolaus, singes the heads or cauterizes the heads so that they don't grow back as well. Okay. In the next scene, we have a very sort of dramatic work of art with a blue sky here. And this is by Luca Giordano, 1634 to 1705. It's an oil painting of the mythological scene of the rape of Proserpine, it's called, who we also know in Greek mythology as Persephone. We may know that Hades stole Persephone and took her off to the underworld. And this is him stealing her, carrying her away into the underworld. Okay, so very dramatic imagery there. In the next slide, we then have a fantastic animal. Again, just another creature that we see presented to us as a guardian, perhaps, or as a monster. This is, again, pre-Babylonian, so it's from the Middle East, and it's in terracotta. And we have a fantastic animal, a dragon with the head of a serpent, nose barred to indicate scales, incised lines around eyes to indicate lids, and skin folds overlapping them. 2 horns, coiled spiral on head, hair down back of neck, body of quadruped, covered with knobby scales, 4 legs of a lion, hind legs of an eagle, talons, an erect, short, thick tail covered with hatched lines, a serrated crest on the chest, and so on and so forth. Okay, so again, this I would oftentimes describe as a chimera as well, because it's just a combination of all of the horrible aspects of a creature that you can imagine and package them all up into one. Okay. Next, we have a circular metal work. Okay, from the Sassanid dynasty, again in the Middle East. This is pre-Islamic Persia, from the Sasanian dynasty. Now, this would be most closely connected to our Zoroastrian myths that we read, or Iranian myths that we read. Okay, so this would be more reflective of a Persian mythological tradition. Okay, this is a rendering of a great bird that's called a senmerv. Okay, which was said to have the head of a dog with an open mouth, a forked tongue, canine or feline forepaws having sharp claws, the body of a bird, the tail of a peacock, and so on and so forth. So we've got combining the forms of a peacock, a lion, a griffin, and a dog. Okay. And in the Avesta, which is a very ancient text in the Zoroastrian tradition, and in the Persian tradition, this creature is apparently mentioned several times. Okay. When the Senmerv wanders forth, he scatters the dry seed of a tree into the water, and it is rained back to the earth with the rain. Okay, so it's connected to fertility in that way as well. Okay. On your next slide, we have represented this is the Old Babylonian period, about 1000 BC. This is the ogre or the giant Humbaba, okay, who comes to us in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Humbaba is the giant guardian of the cedar forest. Deep within the cedar forest is his sacred tree, which Gilgamesh chops down with an axe. And then Humbaba comes to attack Gilgamesh, who asks Shamash for help. Shamash sends winds from the 8 directions, which hold Humbaba immobile, and at his surrender, he is decapitated by Gilgamesh. In Babylonian mythology, Humbaba was a demon to whom the tormented prayed. His face was represented by entrails, with which the configurations made by the entrails of sacrificed animals were compared for omens. Lovely. Okay. And then on the next 2 slides, you have some terracotta examples here, some terracotta reliefs, and both of them are representative. They're from first half of the 2nd millennium BCE. Both of them are representative of Gilgamesh's battle with Humbaba and Gilgamesh, his eventually killing of Humbaba. Okay, so lots of pictures there. Lots of pictures. Okay, we also have many guardians of the household. Moving swiftly on. And I've given you, again, a couple of examples here. So we have Bes from ancient Egypt, who was said to be a bandy-legged dwarf with protruding eyes, who protects women in childbirth and wards off demons and dangerous animals that prowl in the night. Okay, we also have Vesta or Hestia, depending on whether you're using the Greek or Roman name, who is the guardian of the fire of the hearth. We have the Menshen from China. 2 gods of gates and doors guard the entrances of houses and temples, and Zhao Jun, a kitchen god who watches over households. Okay, Zhao Jun is also the guardian of the hearth, and insists that all family members fulfill their domestic duties. Each year travels to the heavens to the gods to report the behavior of all family members. So do your chores, I guess. We also have another sort of guardian of the household, but also an extension of this from Mesoamerican myth called the Nahual. So this is an animal or a plant that serves as an individual's spirit double, a constant companion. So every individual would have a different animal or plant that is connected to their spirit and always with them. So Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec god of war, is associated with the hummingbird. And Tezcatlipoca, the dark god of mirrors, is associated with the spotted jaguar. Now, what I have given you on the next few slides, after the slide that's guardians of the household, is representations from Mesoamerican myth of the imagery that connects the god with his or her spirit animal. So I've just given these to you as examples. So don't worry too much about the interpretation of it. just sort of look for the animal imagery here. Okay. The first slide is of Quetzalcoatl, who is known as the feathered serpent. And you can see this very clearly how he's represented. And also represented in this one is Tezcatlipoca. I have trouble with that one. Smoking Mirror, who is represented with the jaguar. All right, so this is the two of them. So if you look a little more closely at the imagery, you're looking for the feathered serpent and the jaguar imagery. On the next slide, which is a little bit busier, again, you can see Tezcatlipoca with the 20-day signs on his body and his costume. And again, you can see some jaguar representations there. And then the next slide is even busier. You can see Tepeoloti, who Heart of the Mountain, which is what Tezcatlipoca is called when he's in his jaguar disguise. Okay, and so this is the busiest slide with all the little squares. But if you look on the top left, the biggest square, you can see the jaguar imagery there. Okay. And then the next one, again, Tezcatlipoca, an Aztec deity. He's represented here. You just have to, I put this in for fun. I thought it was cool. You just have to look for the jaguar representations. Okay. I gave you lots of this stuff to look at because it was so cool. On the next slide, you have a funerary urn, which is pre-Columbian. Again, Tezcatlipoca is represented in it. So just look for the jaguar. Okay. And then the last two slides as well are the circular, the pale gray circular images, showing the moon goddess slain by her brother Huitzilopochtli from the site of the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan. Okay. So again, you're just looking for animal imagery that might be connected to a deity. Okay, in all these. You can use them as little puzzles and you can kind of look through them to see what you can find that is, animal imagery that would fit with a deity. Okay, lots of stuff to look at. Okay, our next figures are messengers. Now, messengers relay messages among the gods, or they serve a particular god, and some move between gods and humans. Oftentimes, they will serve as guides to the afterlife or guides to the underworld. They might lead the dead on a journey, or they might carry messages from the world of the living to the spiritual domain. So the messenger is an interesting character because he or she can usually move between the underworld, the mortal world as such, and then the heavens or a more spiritual world. Okay, so the messengers are sort of interesting because they can more freely move that way. Sometimes the role is ascribed to one god. So sometimes it is an animal as well, like a bird, or the god or goddess may possess animal imagery that connects them to this role. So Hermes, again from Greek myth, has winged sandals and a cap. Sometimes the wings are on his sandals represented, and sometimes they're represented on his cap, sometimes both. And he can fly, okay, like a bird. So that fits, okay. And you can see on the next slide an image of Hermes in the looking very Roman. It says from Greek culture, 300 BCE. Yeah, I guess it looks pretty Greek. I was gonna say it looks a little Roman to me, but it's all good. Hermes known in the Greek tradition, and he's known as Mercury in the Roman tradition. He is the best known of the messenger gods. He wears a traveler's brimmed hat and carries the caduceus, which is a traditional staff or a wand, which is borne by a herald. And the staff is usually has two snakes woven around it. And you can often see this staff all over the world, really, where medicine is available because it's associated with healers. Okay, you might see it on the side of a building, for example, or on the building that houses a medical association, for example. You might see it represented there. Okay. Apollo gifted Hermes the staff after Hermes gifted to him his first lyre, which is an instrument that he constructed from a tortoise shell, a musical instrument. Okay. The caduceus can also serve sometimes as a symbol of the world tree. And again, if you think of the world tree, and we'll get to the world tree in future classes, the world tree does connect at its roots, sort of what's underneath, and then its trunk is in this world, and then its branches head up into the heavens. So the tree is also very symbolic of the messenger and their ability to move between these worlds. Hermes is the son of Zeus and serves as a messenger for him, and he is a guide to the underworld. So he's the only Olympian in the Greek tradition to whom Zeus grants the power to travel freely to and from the home of the gods. So he's able to move back and forth. He's the god of travelers, of boundaries and roads, and he's named for herms, or stone pillars that mark paths, crossroads, or frontiers throughout Greece. He's the one who conducts souls along the road of the dead, and he assists those who must cross from earthly life to the netherworld. He's also a patron of traders and thieves, and of overseas commerce. So he's not always totally honest, and he's also a trickster character. We also have Legba from the African and Faun tradition, and we will read about Legba in future classes. He's a messenger god of the Faun people and an interpreter for the gods, who began to use different languages when they established their own kingdoms. He carries messages between deities and mortals, particularly Fa, the god of divination. And you can find this story on page 166 of your textbook if you're interested. He's the youngest son of the creator goddess Mau. Legba is the translator through whom both deities and mortals must pass in order to address her. He not only transcends boundaries, but he also creates them. He is the Faun deity who separates earth from sky in their creation myth. We also have Eshu from Africa, the Yoruba tradition, who is a trickster god. Again, messengers and tricksters, they go together, right? He's a messenger who acts as a mediator between deities and mortal beings. He brought the art of divination to the people of the earth, and therefore it is his face that is always on the divination board. That's interesting. He crosses the boundary between the heavens, where fate is decreed, and earth, where it is revealed. So fate is decreed in heaven and is revealed on earth, and Eshu can travel back and forth. He serves the purposes of the gods by ensuring that people offer them sacrifices, but he also brings mortals the power of prophecy. But his messages cannot always be trusted. So we see several themes here. And again, when we talk about tricksters in later classes, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. But we see the sort of themes arising between being a messenger, being a trickster, and in some ways not being able to be trusted, or not always being honest as such. Okay. So moving on from messengers then, we get to monsters that are terrifying, shape-shifting, enormous creatures, which are too frightening to describe. They can be very big. They can be supernatural. They can have supernatural strength. They can be grotesque. They can be malicious, noisy, all over frightening. Often, as I mentioned before, the chimera is a kind of a hybrid beast that is composed of all parts of different animals or beasts, sometimes even part human, to sort of really bring home to us the scariest monster we can create in our imagination. Oftentimes, monsters represent the evil or disruptive force that heroes need to overcome. So what monsters do is they really provide us with names for the unknown. And really, this is kind of how they are represented in myth. And in a symbolic sense, this is what the monster is. It really represents our greatest fears. Okay, so whether that monster is the minotaur that lives in a labyrinth and hunts people down and eats them for dinner, or a chimera that has, the head of a lion, the body of a dog, the tail of a snake, these are sort of the things that go bump in the night and that scare us the most. And so that's why we create this kind of imagery. Heroes generally slay monsters that pose a threat to their community's well-being, or they journey in search of an adventure. And again, when we talk about hero myths starting next week, we'll talk about this more. They look for monsters to test their courage, ingenuity, and skill. So it could be said sometimes that the monster only exists so that the hero can demonstrate his or her skills. So the monster only exists so that the hero can grow, or the hero can demonstrate his or her skills, or so that the hero can be revealed as a hero. So, and again, Heracles, who we've looked at a little bit in this, in this slideshow, Heracles is a great example of this, ridding the world of monsters and proving himself worthy. Theseus, again, another Greek hero, is a great example of this as well. Mm-hmm. So the monsters really sort of serve the purpose of storytelling. They offer a very useful means for us to embody that which is malicious, evil, terrifying, or threatening to human societies. So we recognize that wicked forces exist in the world through the act of granting them a body, granting them a name. It gives us a way to define the evils or dangers that have to be exorcised from our communities if there is a monster in them. Okay. It also provides people, or monsters provide people, with someone to blame, a figure to blame, right? And as I mentioned, they serve as ways for us to name the unknown. Okay. Mm-hmm. And monsters come up in so many traditions, right? We have, for Australia's Indigenous peoples, we have ancestral giants and monsters that inhabit the world during its primordial dream time. So they explain the existence of landmarks on Earth. They shape hills, valleys, rivers, springs, and they kind of bring about Australia's landscape. In the same way that in Mesopotamian and Chinese and Norse traditions, dead bodies of Tiamat, Fanku, and Ymir create the world as well, right? And we see them in these kinds of, to some extent, in these kind of monstrous ways, and then they create the landscape from there. Okay. We have the chimera, as I mentioned, in Greek tradition. We have the hydra as well, the 9 heads atop the serpent's body. This is one of Heracles' labors that he has to deal with. We have Perseus dealing with Medusa, again in Greek myth. Greek myth is very famous for this. We have Theseus and the Minotaur. In another tradition, Native North American, the Blackfoot hero, Cthulhu, he rids the world of dangerous creatures in a similar way that Heracles or Theseus does. He's miraculously born from a clot of buffalo blood, and then he grows to manhood within 4 days of his birth. He slays a tribe of cruel bears, a community of rattlesnakes that eat people's flesh. He enters the jaws of a hideous windsucker and rescues the people he finds in its stomach by stabbing the monster in its heart. He rids the world of 7 kinds of vicious beings. Okay, that was Cthulhu from the Native North American Blackfoot tradition. We also have Gilgamesh, who, as mentioned before, he kills the terrifying giant Humbaba, right? He uses his axe, and he's helped out by Shamash, the god of the sun, as well. Sometimes as well, we might use monsters to explain events, like why people drown or why people get sick, and so on and so forth. So I've given you just a few examples here. Now these ones are, the next few slides are, the next 3 slides actually, are all representations of an archaeological artifact called Odin's Death. And some of you may have used this for your first analytical assignment. Okay, now essentially what this is that you have a pencil drawing first, which represents the artifact on paper. And then underneath it, you have two pictures of it, of the actual artifact itself. And the reason that I have given you this, again, it's from Norse mythology, is just, it is a representation of Odin's death and, you know, the battle of, or the myth of Ragnarok. So I won't go into depth about Ragnarok here, but what I think is interesting is that the representation of Odin in connection to wolves. And as we know, wolves show up fairly frequently in Norse mythology. The god Odin keeps two wolves, Jerry and Freki, or Geri and Freki, right? And it's also said, though, that Odin himself is a shapeshifter and can transform into a wolf. And so that's why I've included it here. So again, you can just look at it and, you know, see what you can draw from it, but you can see very clearly the imagery of the wolf here, which I think is interesting. So we have this kind of connection between human and animal that leads to monster in some ways, right? We also have the Fenrir wolf who shows up, right? The offspring of Loki as well. So we have this kind of overlap of animal and human. That's very interesting, I think. All right. In this slide following that, the horizontal one, again, you could see just by looking at it that it is from the Mesopotamian area, right? The Assyrian, the Babylonian area. Again, it's from the Middle East, just by nature of its imagery. Okay, we start to get to know these things a little bit. This is from the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, from the Sargonid period. Okay, and the reason that I have included this one is because, again, it represents on some level the lead up to the battle of Marduk and Tiamat. Here in the center, we have Ea, or Enki, represented. And Enki is a trickster kind of character. He was the one who originally held the 7 Mi in that we come to later on when we read the tale of Inanna, or Ishtar. She acquired the 7 Mi from Enki. And so here we have Enki enthroned in his shrine, the Apsu, which is formed of the rising and falling waters of the abyss. On the left, we have 2 solar gods, one with a leg extending from the skirt, standing with one foot on a winged lion, while the other foot steps on crouching falling water, or sorry, on, I lost my line, on a crouching deity, treading on a lion between 2 mountains. So again, we have like this overlap of animal and kind of god imagery, as well as imagery of the landscape, right? It's conjectured that the gods may be the Akkadian Shamash and the Sumerian Utu, who correspond to one another, which is why I included it, because we also just talked about Shamash and how he helps Gilgamesh to kill Humbaba, Shamash being the god of the sun. Marduk arrives from this. So Marduk springs not from the twin peaks of the sunrise, but from between the wings, which represent the split body of Tiamat, of chaos, whom he caught in his net of ordered being, mentioned in the text as a dove flung down. This is such beautiful imagery. It's such a different way to consider the battle of Marduk and Tiamat. From between the wings, which represent the split body of Tiamat, right? Since gods are not killed, the battle which Marduk fought on the day of creation was eternally repeated. At the yearly reenactment in Babylon, the king renewed on the ziggurat both his own reign and the life of the land. So this is the same as what I was talking about before, how the battle of Marduk and Tiamat would be replayed or re-represented again and again by kings as a symbol of the way in which they achieve their own rule, right? So in that way, the myth is very symbolic, as I mentioned before, okay? Yeah. And then the last 2 slides that you have are from, they're called Vikings. So they're Scandinavian. So this would be in some ways pre-Norse, right? Mythology. And I've included them just because I thought they were interesting. They are tombstones, original tombstones from 800 to 1050 CE. Both of them are very long and rectangular, 3 times as long as they are tall, and stretching almost the length of the stone just above the center, particularly on the first one, is a horizontal line. And there are designs and figures both above and below the line. In the photograph, the figures below are more visible, and they are 4 anthropomorphic figures, 2 at each end of the line, with their arms upraised as if they were holding up the upper half of the stone. A number of animals are depicted between the 2 sets of human-like figures. So it's the interpretation is that it is a Norse tombstone carved in low relief, which depicts 4 mythic dwarves supporting the sky. The figures illustrate the creation of the sky out of the primordial body of Ymir and support it from the 4 corners of the earth. So I just thought that was an interesting image because, again, when we start talking about the underworld and death, then we always kind of make a return to the creation as well, right? And we notice that this often happens. Additionally, what I think it's important to remind ourselves of, and the story of Marduk and Tiamat and the artifacts that I've shown you here are really good representations of this, excuse me, is that myth is really cyclical, and for every end, there's always a beginning. And so this is represented in the artifacts. This is also represented in the creation and recreation of the same stories in imagery, in archaeological artifacts, in art, and so on and so forth. So these are just a few examples of guardians, messengers, monsters, lesser deities, lesser gods and goddesses who show up, lesser figures, shall I say, who show up periodically for us in myth and who are no less important than the more popular figures that we might be more familiar with, but are equally as important because they help to move the story forward. And again, they represent different aspects of each culture and how those cultures represent myth in imagery.